Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to day 8 of the HerStory Online Summit. I can't believe we have been online for 8 days, bringing you amazing stories from all over the world. The HerStory Circle is not just a speaking platform. We are a social impact movement that brings you the extraordinary tales of everyday women and men who are changing the world. My name is Gertrude Mache, and I am the founder and global curator of the HerStory Circle movement. And I'm really honored to be joining you this morning from beautiful Melbourne, Australia. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people who are joining us from around the world. Over the next few days, we'll dive into the lives, challenges, and triumphs of remarkable people, stories of courage, resilience, creativity, and leadership, stories that remind us that when women rise, communities and nations rise with them. This summit is more than just a series of talks. It's a global circle, a space for inspiration, connection, and transformation. Together, we will share knowledge, ignite conversations, and plant seeds of change. So I invite you to grab a cup of coffee, settle in, open your heart, and allow yourself to be inspired by the incredible journeys that we will hear. This is her story because every woman's voice matters and every story has got the power to change the world. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my first guest today, a very special man who represents what it means when allyship steps in to help women rise. I made a decision a few years ago that 25% of our speakers would be male. I got a lot of backlash from our community, people saying, Gertrude, why are you allowing men into the space? It's sacred. But I have 2 sons, and I want my sons and my grandson to grow up in a world where they are aware of the issues, of the stories that women go through. So unless we start bringing men into the room when we are discussing our issues, we are talking to ourselves. So we opened up the doors. One of those amazing men is with us today. Now, Tom, when I first met you, I felt like I was talking to a brother from another mother. Tom is an international speaker, a resilience coach, an executive leader who empowers individuals and organizations to lead through change. A former executive at Facebook, Walmart, and Palm, he created the risk ability factor to support bold, purpose-driven leadership. Tom is the CEO of Academy for Coaching Excellence. He coaches leaders and change makers. His personal journey through illness fuels his mantra, I'm still here, an invitation to rise and lead. Welcome, 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 Tom. The stage is yours, my brother.
It's so wonderful to be with you, Gertrude. What a beautiful summit you're having. Hello, viewers. I am so grateful to be with you today. I have a question for you. What would you do if 3 times 3 different doctors told you you have 6 months to live? Well, I laughed. Not because it was funny. Believe me, it wasn't funny. I laughed because I knew something the doctors didn't. This wasn't my first storm in life. And for the record, if you ever want to see a full room full of doctors get very uncomfortable, laughed after being told you might die. I wore the suits. They said, I've got this. I had executive roles at Facebook, Walmart, Palm, big meetings, big egos, IPOs, stock options, global strategy decks with 97 slides, and I was proud of every one of them. I want you to know that if I had held onto my Facebook stock, I would be worth $250 million today. Instead, I sold it, and here's the kicker: I don't regret it. And yes, $250 million could buy a lot of therapy, but it couldn't have brought what I eventually found, a new life. It wasn't enough. I wanted to do more. What are you still wearing that no longer fits? What's your version of a suit, that mask, role, or identity that's outlived its purpose? Now let's talk about the opposite of that power suit, the hospital gown. You know, that flimsy piece of clothing with one breeze that turns you into a full-blown weather advisory with your rear end out. 3 times I heard the same thing: you have 6 months to live. The gown stripped away all the external stuff, titles, plans, the calendar was gone, until all that was left was me. What I once thought was a death sentence became terrible gifts. What's a terrible gift? You know, in life, when things happen that you don't really want to happen, it's something that happens with a relationship or your health or a loved one, but you learn something from it. You're given a gift, often not realized till years later. Well, I call those terrible gifts. We all have things in our life that can bring us to our knees. While not at the moment, we often receive a gift from the experience. Again, a terrible gift. They showed me what was real, what mattered, and what could no longer wait. Resilience isn't the power to push through, it's the strength to surrender to what's true and choose again. What has life stripped away from you lately, and what clarity did you gain for it? Where do you feel most exposed and maybe most real? Now, way before the suits and hospital gowns, I chose something else, something bold, unexpected, and completely me. I put on a pair of heels. Yes, actual heels. No, I didn't fall, and yes, I looked fabulous. You'll have to read the book to find out more, but the heels weren't about fashion. They were about expressing myself, about choosing wholeness. They are a part of who I am today. They carried me forward, and they are, again, part of who I am today. What's your version of heels? What symbol or ritual or reclaiming act says, I'm still here? So I wrote a book about it. All these 3 lives of mine, what I felt were 3 disparate lives. The book is called My Life in Business Suits, Hospital Gowns, and High Heels. It takes 3 separate lives and demonstrates how it's really one. Our path, no matter how outrageous, how risk-filled, or successful, made you who you are today. The sum of it all adds up to the you that exists today. The business suit, the hospital gown, and even those heels moved me into service. Today, I'm a philanthropist. I'm a coach. I speak. I do nonprofit work. I have my own podcast. But my purpose in life is to be of service to others. And while I didn't make the $250 million, I made enough to make a big difference. You know, I love the dandelion. I even use it as my logo. Most people see a dandelion as a weed. I see it as a miracle. It grows in cracks. It survives storms. It comes back even when you poison it. And when the wind hits it, it doesn't fall apart. It spreads. And that's what we're here for. Not to bounce back, but to bounce forward. To grow through the cracks of life. To rise into our own wild, untamed way. I'm curious, where are you being asked to grow, even in unwanted places? So whether you're in a suit, a gown, or your heels right now, know this: You don't need to go back to what was. You don't need to wait for permission. You are allowed to begin right now. Every storm runs out of rain, and when it does, the soil is richer than ever. My only question for you is, what will you plant?
Absolutely wonderful, Tom. Wow. You have been on quite a journey. And what excites me about having you as our first speaker today is we want to focus on the power of giving. You became a philanthropist for a reason. And I would like you to share, first of all, maybe a story of what changed your life when someone gave to you.
You know, I was really fortunate, Gertrude, that my parents, even though we had very, very humble times, we had a lot of love, but they were always focused on how you might help others. And so I think that got into my DNA. And I've had people along this journey give me things and support me with things. One time, my brother was very ill and he died, and I had no money to go visit, to go to the hospital, and I had to fly across the country, and someone gave me that money to do that. I've had people give me, even today after a speech, walk up and hand me $5 and say, I wish it was more. That touched me more than anything I was paid from the speech or what I got out of it. So these are things that I've received. You know, for some, philanthropy is like a gala dinner or a giant check or getting their name on the building. It's really not something we do. It's a way of being. It's a misperception that philanthropy is only about money. It's something I like to talk about called the philanthropic mindset.
Hmm. So, in the same light of the questions, what changed your life when you gave to someone else? Tell us a little bit about your nonprofit, what you're doing, and what is the most pivotal story that you remember?
Yes, you know, it's cliche for some people, but it's really true. The more you give, the more you get back. And it's a cycle that I believe is super important. I think the universe actually gets really angry when you don't continue the cycle of giving and receiving, remembering that you also get to receive, not just give. So my philanthropy revolves around a few things. I'm very focused on underserved communities, women's relevant issues, youth in the arts, first gen students, hunger. And my CPA and I, Gina, we also have a small nonprofit. And my two favorite programs that we do, one is women that are discharged from the hospital after domestic violence. They're discharged and there's no thought to how they get acquainted with their body. And we offer a program where they can do Pilates or acupuncture to be able to reacquaint themselves. And one of my favorites is there's a woman in Oakland, California that sees little at-risk boys on the street and she teaches them the saxophone to give them an identity. We just make it possible so she can teach more at-risk boys the saxophone.
Wow. Now, you said that your purpose in life is to be of service to others. Was there a specific experience or a turning point that anchored this commitment?
I think, you know, when you give to others and you see the benefit of it, I was really lucky one time recently, and it's been a few years ago actually, where the first gen students, they have a graduation within the nonprofit. These
Mhm.
people graduate from college and they excelled in high school and would have never had the opportunity to go to college. And I believe everyone should have that right, especially when they're excelling. They didn't know when they went home at night whether the lights would be on, but they were still excelling in school. So I went to one of these special graduations, and there was a BIPOC kid that had been put through school. And instead of watching what was going on the stage, I watched his family. And I literally watched his mother levitate in the chair. She was so proud. No one in their family had ever achieved such a thing. And to know that I had a little part in that person's life and the ripple effect that was going to happen in that family going forward was unbelievably rewarding. This woman was so elated at what was going on. You know, I really believe that my life is dedicated, it's someone's quote, but I like to say it, to planting trees for which I will never see the shade of.
Yeah, that's just so beautiful. Now, throughout your work, you have served many people, and many people equate success with financial wealth. Yet you walked away from the possibility of 250 million. How has your definition of wealth evolved in the concept of philanthropy?
I'm richer than I could have ever been.
Mm,
I have a wonderful life. I'm very comfortable. I have everything I need. And I believe that those of us that do well have a responsibility to give back to others. You know, the definition of philanthropy is love of humanity. That's its Greek roots. And
mm,
there's two myths about it. I'm not rich enough, or I don't have the time. And it's just not accurate. You know, your giving expands you as a giver, and it will build your empathy, your purpose, and your resilience in life. And I find that over and over again, it's a mindset. It's not about how much money you have. You can be a philanthropist with your smile.
mhm. Yeah, so giving is not just about money, and this is the important thing that people need to remember, right?
Yes, it is. I mean, imagine if we lived in a world where philanthropy isn't an event. It's not an event that happens. It's actually a reflex. It's a
Yeah.
response you have to something you see where you know you can be of service or help. I like to remind people at times that, you know, when someone makes a donation, one person writes $1,000 check, another people gives you 4 quarters. When you look at those two gifts, they are more the same than they are
Different.
dissimilar,
Yeah.
because it comes from the person's wealth and what they have. The meaning behind the gift is the same.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I remember my grandmother used to say that when you give to someone else, you're really giving to yourself, and that it comes back tenfold in very unexpected ways. Normally, it's never from the people that you've helped, but miracles happen around your own life. And I've witnessed this and experienced this throughout my life as well.
Yes.
Now, I love, sorry, do you want to say something else there
I was
before
just
I?
going to say that the greatest gift you can give is how you show up for humanity.
Mhm.
There's so many ways we can show up and offer a gift that isn't just about a check or cash or
Yeah.
any of those things.
Now, you use the dandelion as your symbol, spreading seeds even through after a storm. How does this metaphor reflect the way that you view giving back to communities?
You know, I think that I'm a believer that when you spread it around, like happens to the dandelion,
Yeah.
there are others that are motivated by it. I trust that some of the first gen students will remember what was given to them and will perpetuate that.
Yeah.
I trust that women that are offered things going through a very hard time will offer that to others in the future as a result of their experience in being cared for.
Yeah.
I trust that the little at risk boy who got the saxophone lesson might become a huge success as a saxophone player and give back. It's the ripples you don't see that happen, and I just have faith they do.
I love it. And when you told me about the dandelion, again, I'll keep going back to my grandmother. She used to say that for a tree to survive, it has to scatter its seed as far away from it as possible. So the wind carries those little dandelion seeds, and you're literally placing them in fertile ground with your work and allowing them to grow and to thrive. So I really love that analogy. It's absolutely beautiful. Now, how do you balance philanthropy as both personal healing and a way of creating social change?
I think that through my philanthropy, I'm able to inspire others to be change makers. So, for example, at the Academy for Coaching Excellence, where I'm the CEO, we have a program where we offer scholarships, and they're specifically targeted in underserved communities. And
Mhm.
in fact, in the beginning, it was primarily just BIPOC women. Because
Wow.
what I noticed in this coaching academy is the people that were able to come and become coaches, certified coaches, and go through the program had money. They had the resources to do it. And I
Mhm.
thought, if we're going to change, if we're going to be change makers, if we're going to change what's going on in all communities, we have to make that opportunity available. So we started the Empowered Together program to be able to start that. And I'm proud to say we've now trained many coaches that have vibrant practices in those communities that nothing would ever have. Again, I trust that that will perpetuate itself.
The ripple effect will keep going. We've got somebody chiming in from Canada, a very good friend of mine. Thank you so much for being here and watching. I've noticed that you have been tuning in to the summit this past week. Wow. So, Tom, you describe resilience as surrounding to truth and choosing again. How does that philosophy shape the way that you design and support philanthropic projects?
I see resilience, risk as well. I see it as just like we exercise our bicep or tricep to have bigger arms and healthy and toned arms. Resilience is the same way. The more you use it, the more you exercise it, the better you become at weathering the storms that are in life. And so I think the same thing happens in philanthropy. When you're resilient in what you do, trusting that whatever you're giving out, there'll be plenty, you won't run out, keep giving it away, keep moving it around, keep circulating it, and it will keep going and perpetuate itself. It's the
Mhm.
resilience of philanthropy.
I love it. I love it. Now, let's talk about community impact. What are some of the most meaningful causes or communities that you've been able to support? I know you mentioned a few, but I know there's a lot more.
Recently on my podcast, I interview tech CEOs and founders, and I also interview nonprofit executive directors.
Mhm.
And one of the recent ones that I met that prompted me to write a check immediately was, she has a nonprofit called Period. And it's just what you think it is about. And when I learned for women and girls where the products that are needed don't exist, I wrote a
Mhm.
check immediately. That was so inspiring to me because I thought to myself, as a man, maybe I just don't know this. But as I realized, many people don't realize that that's the situation. And my favorite part about this story is it started from youth. This nonprofit started from youth. She became the leader, but it was something that bubbled up from our youth. And when that happens for me, what I feel is we're going to be all right. Everything's going to be okay when I know that the young people are conscious about these things. It's so important. I think I also am very engaged in GLBTQ causes. There's so many people today that are marginalized, or the suicide rate is huge, and how we
Mhm.
help in that area to make people know that everyone's life is worthwhile. We all deserve love. We all deserve to be recognized as the human being we are, and the ability to contribute.
Mm. Period poverty is a very real thing. It's interesting. Yesterday, we had a speaker who's based in St. Louis, I think, a young woman who became HIV positive at the age of 17, at the time when there were no drugs, even in the United States. Dr. Nishi Parkinson's is her name. And she has survived, she has blossomed, she has a nonprofit, and that's one of her focuses in the US. Because a lot of people think that this is happening in third world countries, but it's
No.
all over the world. There's marginalized communities everywhere where period poverty is a very real thing.
Yes, I love that she's doing that because it's just so important, right? It's one of those things that's just the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, how do you ensure that your philanthropy goes beyond charity and instead builds sustainable transformation? So, I'm from Zimbabwe. I've seen a lot of charities that come, people mean well, they come in with resources, but sometimes things are done without consultation with the people they serve, and then the projects fail. So, what are you doing about sustainability?
Yeah, one of the things I learned is that um, you can give too much money. You can
Mhm.
give too much resource to someone that's not prepared. So having a dialogue about not only what they're looking for, but getting involved with the experience you have to ensure one of the things they never get money for is the administration of a nonprofit. And
Yes.
Gina and I and our small nonprofit, one of the things we focus on is grassroots organizations. Once you start getting big grants or the government gets involved, we go to find new grassroots. So we
Mm,
like to do things to get things started and support things that get them off the ground and
right.
and even be mentors to it as they grow and then blossom and are able to get better funding. And then we're back to trying to find some more grassroots things. And then
Oh,
I like to look at things that are also bigger nonprofits that are stable, that fit in the purview of what I enjoy giving to, what's meaningful to me, which I shared
mhm.
with you earlier, is about underserved communities and the things that I shared.
Wonderful. I want to move on now to leadership and philanthropy. Having led at Facebook, Walmart, and Palm, how did your corporate leadership experience prepare you to approach philanthropy differently?
I think that there's a couple answers to that. One is you can be the philanthropy mindset, the philanthropic mindset in those leadership roles. So, like at Facebook, I was old enough to be everyone's father. I
Oh,
skewed the age dramatically because in those early days, everybody was fresh out of school, working their dream job, deferring business school, law school, just to work at Facebook. Well,
yes,
you suddenly end up with a huge population of people that you have the opportunity to share your wisdom and what you know. And
yes.
and to me, that is a form of philanthropy, of passing that on. I think also I am proud to say that in many of those companies, I was also involved in the philanthropic mission of the company.
Okay.
Companies are very worried about whether it's aligned with their brand, and they can shy away from it because they don't want to have anybody call them out for something. Well, when you have a
Mm,
few people, that's all it takes to feel really dedicated to making that happen, and
yes,
pushing and making it happen. Suddenly, something comes of it, and usually the return process, in fact, I'll say always, is something people in the company are very proud of.
that's beautiful. That's absolutely wonderful. Now, in your work with the Academy for Coaching Excellence, how do you integrate philanthropy into the leadership development for others?
We basically, our focus is change makers. So we trust that the people that we're training to be coaches are going to continue our mission on of helping people and balancing out of how we all have to make money, but balancing out how to serve people that um, can't afford some of our rates and offering them those things too. Because again, I believe there's a ripple effect that carries it on. So we really
Yeah.
focus on the change maker community. We offer the scholarships.
Okay.
We mentor people through the process, and so that's how we focus on it.
That's beautiful. What advice would you give leaders who want to make philanthropy part of their business DNA rather than as an afterthought?
I think the first thing is to remember that these kinds of things come from the top. If who's ever leading doesn't believe in it, then
Mm,
it's very hard to affect change and make it happen. So you must engage the leaders, and it's not hard to do. You just have to help them see the purpose of it. So I think that's one of the biggest things is to engage at all levels and
yes.
ensure that people are committed to it and find something and then report back in to make sure they understand what the benefits are and keep it in front of them.
Yeah. It has to be forefront. Otherwise, people forget.
It's true.
Oh my gosh. Now, legacy and inspiration. You said, "I'm still here" is your mantra, and I absolutely love it. How does philanthropy help you live that truth daily?
Well, Gertrude, I am the survivor of two life-threatening illnesses. I was told one of them was terminal 36 years ago, and I'm still here. I've
Mhm.
lived with metastatic cancer the last 13 years. And the best thing that happens to me is one, I'm given a lot. There are people who take care of me. I have access to things that so many people don't, and I'm so grateful for that. So for me, it's as simple as like last year, I had 3 series of radiation, not 3 incidents, 3 series. And when you're in the waiting room, you can get all freaked out about what's getting ready to happen. But I've exercised that resilience muscle, and I see people that I can see the fear in their face, and I don't.
Mm,
I strike up just a casual conversation of "Hi, how are you today?" That always, almost always, leads to that fear being expressed. And I
mhm.
know that from experiencing it, and my philanthropic mind can
Yeah,
share with them what the doctors don't about what's getting ready to happen, how it's going to be, what they're going to see. So when you go in that room and there's this weird, huge machine whirling around your body, you didn't do it just cold. You had someone to share with you what it's going to be like and what it's going to feel like, which is basically
mhm.
nothing, and how you might feel later. So it's
Yeah,
some of those things that people just don't have time to explain, that you sort of dismantle the fear and the anxiety of what they're getting ready to experience. So to me, those things are using my philanthropic mindset.
yeah. And you get to do that and support other people as you're going through your own struggle, which is absolutely mind blowing. Oh my gosh. So, what do you hope your philanthropic legacy will look like 20 years from now?
Well, I won't be here is the answer. So I hope that whatever I built carries on long after I'm here. And
Mhm.
90%, maybe 95 of what I do is anonymous. So I'm not in it for the lights or the name. It's not what it's about for me. But I'm trying to build something that will continue, at least in a few niches, to support people going forward, because there's never going to be a shortage of a need to help others.
My last two questions go back to the power of giving, Tom. If giving is so important, why is giving so important for the future of humanity?
I think that if we look at what's going on in the world today, and I don't want to get political or even religious or anything like that, but there
Mhm.
are places that are in dire need, there are people that are in dire need. And we are all human beings. Will always be far more alike than we will be different. We all want love. We all want to laugh. We all want a roof over our heads, food to eat, water to drink. So I think that some of these basic necessities of life will always be needed. And I love the example of period products. It's another example that will go on forever. That's not going to change. So it's a great example. And I love what your guest is working on, along with the person I was sharing that's running this nonprofit here in California, because these needs will go on forever, and they're far and wide. We'll never, ever get by with the fact, whether we want to believe it or not, we're all on one planet. It's the only one we've got.
We've got to take care of it. So, Tom, for those people who are listening, who are inspired by your story, what can we do to support you? What are the things that you need?
Well, you can find me at tomlinoble.com. You see that on the screen. I'm on LinkedIn and most social media. And I've shared with you just a few of the nonprofits. I have a nonprofit. If anything I spoke to you speaks to you, I'd love to talk to you. And if you have an idea or a question about what it means to have a philanthropic mindset, I'm here to talk to you about it.
That's wonderful because anyone can be a philanthropist. You don't have to be rich to do it.
You don't
It's a
have to be rich
mindset.
to do it.
I
It is a
love
mind.
it. Thank you so much, Tom. And while we're talking about the power of giving, I just want to share with our community that every year when we have this online summit, we pick a philanthropic project to get behind. Sometimes it's children, the elderly, the disabled. This year, it's one of our community, an amazing woman who is based in New South Wales, Australia. Bernice Williams has gone through several rounds of chemo like you, Tom. I think she's had cancer 3 times. Her husband has had cancer several times as well. And she's now fighting against leukemia. We are trying to help her raise $20,000. So the family has exhausted what the government can help them in terms of health care, and they're now having to pay out of pocket. Bernice has managed to find a donor just last week, a South African, who's going to give her the bone marrow that she needs for her transplant. So please go online, everybody, contribute whatever you can. It doesn't have to be a lot of money. A few dollars here and there add up because we're such a big community. So go on to GoFundMe, 8768D7E8, for those of you who are visually impaired. Let's help Bernice fight this challenge. She is the grandmother at the age of 60 who looks after 2 little kids. So she has in her care 2 grandchildren who are under the age of 10 as well. Tom, thank you for reminding all of us what the power of giving can do. I look forward to finally meeting you in person, and I will hold you down to that invitation to come to Hawaii.
I'm ready.
I will hold you down to that, Tom. Thank you so much for opening up the day with such positivity.
Gertrude, thank you for having me on. And I've just really enjoyed your summit, and I'm enjoying even more getting to know you. What a wonderful human being you are.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye for now. Wow, what an amazing start to the summit. You know, I pray that the universe brings me the right people to this platform. Every single day, God surprises me with these magical human beings who are go-givers and not go-getters. People who are now part of my community who want to leave the planet a better place than we found it. So Tom is a real amazing example of that. And I hope you've been inspired and you will go onto his website, connect with him, find out about the work that he's doing, and see what you can do to bring about change in your community as well. With that, we're going to move on to our next speaker, another incredible human being who I had the pleasure of interviewing a few months ago. We've stayed in touch. Dr. Christine Gibson is an amazing woman. I'll read your bio, and then you will take over the stage and inspire us with your amazing story this morning. So she is a board-certified family doctor, a trauma therapist, an author, a social media educator. With over 2 decades of clinical experience, she combines her expertise in medicine and trauma therapy to help individuals and communities to heal from stress, burnout, and collective trauma. Through her writing, her workshops, and her social media presence, she educates and empowers people to understand that the science of resilience and the impact of trauma on the body and mind, and how storytelling can transform healing. Christine is the author of the Modern Trauma Toolkit and the founder of initiatives that bridge healthcare, therapy, and education. Her mission is to democratize access to trauma-informed tools so people everywhere can feel empowered in their healing journey. So thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your amazing story. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Gertrude. It's nice to see you again. Hello to those watching the summit. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to be a little bit deliberate and not share the same story that I was describing on the podcast that we had already recorded, which was surrounding my work in Nepal and the earthquake that I survived and how that's led me to learn more about trauma. What I wanted to share more about today was just this idea of a flipped hierarchy. So as Gertrude goes through my bio, like, I'm Christy, I'm like a pretty easygoing person, but on paper I sound super fancy. I've got an MD, I've got a D Prof, so 2 doctorates, a master's in medical education, 2 board certifications in family medicine and lifestyle medicine, and 2 clinical departments that I'm a part of. But one of the things that was the most important lesson for me was when I am not the expert, and how often community is the expert. And this was a large focus of my first TED Talk. And I've got a few different examples of that, but one that I wanted to share today was just what does it look like to really harness the community as experts? So while I have all of those fancy letters after my name, one of the things that I recognized when I was doing family practice, particularly in an equity deserving setting, was just how often the patients would find their own solution to things. And for a lot of physicians, like, we're told we solve problems, we fix, we cure. I mean, so often the patient is the expert on their experience and their context, and many times their solutions as well. And whether or not that's curative versus healing, there's a difference. Like, curing is like the problem goes away, and healing is living with. Um, Patients often come up with their own solutions. And so one of the many things that I studied that was so interesting to me was this concept of social innovation. And we always think of innovation as like, well, what's the technology that we're inventing, or these like new tools that are concrete things. And social innovation is like how do you solve complex problems? And what I learned is that it's rarely me as a physician with all these fancy letters behind my name, but I can often be a catalyst or a facilitator to solve complex problems. So one of the things that I had the absolute privilege to do was to briefly run something called the Solution Studio. And we ran it out of a health center. So we would invite people who had a particular lived experience. So some of the examples I can share would be we asked people who were dealing with chronic pain conditions to come to the studio. We asked people who had mobility challenges, so they used a wheelchair or a walker or some other mobility device, to come and share. And so we did it in a really structured way. There's kind of 3 steps to the Solution Studio. I put a bit of a paper out about it. And it's actually, this process is in my book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, because when we think about trauma, it's so easy to think of trauma in the individual body, and we don't often think of it as much of, well, how does trauma impact a community? Sometimes it's obvious. Like, if you look at what happens to the Latin community in the States that doesn't have an active green card. I personally work at the refugee clinic, so I think of the kinds of traumas that are faced that might have been more pervasive within these communities. But as a family doctor, you're always dealing with that one person in front of you and trying to solve these really complex challenges they're facing. And what I learned was, if you bring people together that are facing these complex challenges as a community, they have a much higher chance of solving the problem than somebody who's so disconnected from it. And that's what we did. So the first step was, like, let's actually look at what the issue is. We used something called the iceberg model, which was so we used 2 different models. The first one was an empathy map, and I would often flip it and call it a compassion map. We tried to use hypothetical scenarios, like, what is this person seeing and doing and hearing? What are they feeling inside? And we tried not to base it on one person's experience in the room, but like, what's it like to face this issue? One of the issues we talked about was trauma. What's it like to come to a health center, having been a person who's gone through trauma? And what are you seeing and hearing? What are you experiencing inside that we could potentially make a more trauma-informed space for you? So asking these really complex questions. So we'd come up with this compassion map for the hypothetical person. And then the second model we would use is the iceberg. And the iceberg was kind of like, well, what are the pain points that are really, really acute. So like, let's say it's a mobility community, and they were like, well, we live in Western Canada. This is what it's like when we face snow, and just how much snow changes what they can do in a day. This isn't something I had spent a lot of time thinking, but it affects everything. It affects their groceries, so their nutrition. It affects their ability to get to see friends and neighbors and their sense of isolation and belonging. And it definitely affects health, whether or not they can get to appointments. So if they have some kind of ability to get to the train or not. So these were the kinds of complex layers that those of us who are supposed to be these experts could never be able to solve. In the iceberg model, we factor in like, what are the policies that are affecting them? And then what kinds of institutions are helping or contributing or making it worse, causing obstacles? And then once they've done that analysis, like what are the pain points? What are the things that they're experiencing for this hypothetical person facing this problem? And then doing this like really deep systems level analysis of what's helping or hindering those pain points, then they just generate solutions. And it was really fun because we would just use lots of Post-it notes. I'm a huge fan of Post-its. We would create this graph that was like simple to complex and individual to systemic, and people would just put Post-its. And then what I loved about the health center where I was practicing is they said, well, if we can facilitate these solutions happening, we're going to do it. And so when I was sharing about the solution studio afterwards, I would say, well, we had this chronic pain group. And the most shocking thing for me as a family doctor was that only men showed up. And anyone who's in healthcare, women are more likely to engage when it comes to things like mental health and talking about feelings. And these men came to talk. They came to share their feelings. And the first thing that they wanted to do after this one meeting that we had was, could we form a chronic pain men's group where we actually get to share how hard this is to face? So one of the social workers had also faced chronic pain, and he's like, I would love to facilitate this group. So I think it ran consistently for about 6 months, where this group of men, and we opened it up to the whole clinic and just said, this is a men's group for chronic pain where you can talk about solutions you've found, frustrations you're running into, and what it's like day to day. And that is a really deeply healing practice for people to actually be able to share authentically, to feel validated, to feel support from the community. And as much as, physicians are useful, we can provide medications, we can provide a listening ear, but we can't provide that. And I would have never thought it. So it was really cool to be able to do that. The other thing they wanted was they wanted a screaming room. So we had this music room in the health center, and they actually turned it into a room where they could scream. And then it kind of turned into a band. And I mean, it evolved into something really, really cool. But it just started off as like, where can I scream? What a good question I never would have thought to ask. So when I think about when I do talks about like trauma-informed spaces, and when I talk about that in the Modern Trauma Toolkit or on my social media, I learned so much from those kinds of experiences. Like, what have my patients gone through? What did the Solution Studio teach me? And in just to bring it full circle to why I wanted to talk about this, in my first TED Talk, I was really talking about the earthquake experience. And so one of the stories from that for me was that I started studying PTSD and trauma. But the other thing that I really learned was I am not the expert. The community was the expert. And so in Nepal in 2015, when I survived the earthquake, the thing that was so obvious to me was how the community came together. And I was a little bit separate from the community. So one of the things that was hard for me in terms of post-traumatic symptoms was I was facing this event in isolation because I wasn't Nepali, and the Nepali doctors were really busy. They didn't need me involved. And what was really beautiful is community came together. They would get this like giant pots, and they were making rice, and they were making curries and lentils and dal and all these things to feed the neighborhood. It wasn't like one family looking out for each other. There was this whole community coming together, feeding 100 people at a time. they were going to the houses and digging family members out of rubble. And as much as I have all these letters behind my name, I am not community. And it's hard for me to solve complex challenges. And that was such a really important learning curve for me. So as much as I love learning and sharing what I've learned through socials and books and just doing individual clinical work, part of what I ask in these times is like, who is my community and how can I solve complex problems that I face? And then as a practitioner, how can I bring people together to solve those same kinds of problems? So I run this company, Safer Spaces Training. We talk about trauma-informed spaces. We talk about teaching people what trauma feels like. And so much of this is stuff that I learned. I mean, as a physician, I had no idea how traumatized I was by working in a hospital until I'd put a blood pressure cuff on myself and realized that I could have stroked out during my night shift. My pressures were ranging like 200 to 220 over like 120. It was bad. I could have just had a stroke in the night shift because of the amount of stress and chaos that I was under. And we just kind of get told as physicians, like, oh, this is just the job. And you're kind of taught through apprenticeship to suck it up. But once I started examining trauma more and more, I was like, wow, we are a community of people facing physical, emotional, and relational trauma because of how often people get sick. And we can't cure all things. I mean, the human body dies. And so we grieve alongside you. And we also have this sense of shame that we can't fix everything. So all of these processes that were underlying for me for my whole practice and just running in my subconscious mind, so much of it was like, well, what does the community that faces things like vicarious trauma and moral distress and all the stuff that healthcare workers face, what do we do as a community and how do we heal? So I've explored so many things around that. Lissa Rankin, physician in the States, was one of the first people who brought a community together. It was called the Whole Health Medicine Institute. And I was like, oh, we can solve these complex challenges too. And so now from like this trauma perspective, I get to ask the same question. And so much of it was like, well, how do I heal? I became a psychedelic journey guide. I mean, if you'd asked me in medical school if this was something that I would have ever explored, I would have said no. But the more that I started studying, I was like, this really benefits a lot of people. How can I incorporate this into my knowledge base? But then from that iceberg model, what are the policies that are obstructing our use of psychedelics? Those are pretty intense. And then what are the government levels of obstruction? That's a lot too. What does the clinical model look like? So I don't even practice it, but I just really wanted to learn, like, what does a community know about trauma? Community has always gone to church or sung in a group. We've circle danced. We've done these things as communal bodies that are actually processing trauma. We've interacted with herbs and plant medicines. We've done breath and body-based practices. And if you look at almost any ancestral lineage, there have been ways that we've processed trauma. I researched Ayurvedic medicine and then Qigong, which is the healing branch of Tai Chi, and other traditional Chinese medicines. We all have ancestral connections to healing for trauma that so many of us have forgotten about. I mentioned in the last podcast to Gertrude how when I was in Zimbabwe, I visited a traditional healer, and she was throwing cowrie shells to help me understand what was happening in my mind-body system. And as much as I really believe in advanced Western medicine, part of the question that I'm always asking is like, how does the community heal? And one of the differentiators about my book is, like, in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I'm not just asking like what happens with trauma in the individual system, but how does it hit the collective system? And in my own healing, like from the trauma of work that I've done and the kinds of things that I've been through, these experiences, so much of it was learned through like, what does the community know and how do they share it? I'm running out of steam, so I'll invite Gertrude to come back because I'm like, was that 15 minutes? It felt like it was.
were right on 15 minutes. Thank you so much. Wow. It always inspires me when I listen to you speak, because you have an approach that looks at things from a very, very different angle. And I think it's because of your work experience in communities that you've really refined your lens on how to deal with and observe trauma. Now, let's go back to that first story, your experience in Nepal and the earthquake, and how the community dealt with it collectively. You said that people heal better when they're working together. I just want you to explain that concept of how things can amplify your healing when you're not in isolation. And how did you feel when you felt like the outsider in that particular situation?
And there's two different answers to this, Gertrude. And one of them is like the individual physiology. So like, what do our nervous systems do? We have these mirror neurons in our brain that kind of help us share experiences together. So if you get a group of people working on a project together, their brain waves start to sync up, their heart rates start to sync up. Like we are built to do things in community and to do something that's called co-regulation. So co-regulation is what I think a lot about when I do trauma therapy. I want to make sure that my nervous system is feeling as calm as possible, so that when I'm in the room with somebody who's feeling dysregulated or emotional, my nervous system is actually part of that healing process. So the more that you get a group of people who are working in tandem together, they can co-regulate and together kind of heal the nervous system damage that might otherwise cause traumatic responses. So what I now understand about trauma is not the event. It's the way that we physiologically respond to the event. And if we don't feel alone, if we're working in tandem together to do something, we are less likely to experience long-term trauma responses. So that's one of those factors that can be helpful. And it's really important for us to not just look at vulnerabilities, because we always talk about that in medicine, like what's wrong with you? What's the disease name? What's the process? And we're looking for deficits, when what's probably more important is like, what are the supports and the resources? And so that was so obvious to me when I was in Nepal. I was like, wow, what they have is a very community-minded approach. And so in a lot of Western cultures, we're so individualistic. We're like, well, how can I solve this and how can I come out okay? And that's really not how they think in Nepal. And when I think about the mess we're in when it comes to like the climate emergency or political issues, so much of it has to do with inequity and this individualistic nature of people. But when I think about what actually heals, and I don't just mean from like a health perspective or a trauma perspective, I mean like financial healing, I mean relational healing. It's when we do things together.
Now, you mentioned flipped hierarchy, where communities are the real experts. Can you share a moment when a patient's wisdom completely reframed your understanding of healing?
It happens every day. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that flipped for me when I started to gain more understanding of all these concepts is I started, instead of writing in the medical chart my analysis and opinion of the patient situation, I just started to write their exact words. Like, there's just so much wisdom in the kinds of things that I'm hearing, like in between the lines too, like about what the illness experience is like and the things that they've solved. I mean, honestly, it probably happens on a daily basis that somebody plants a seed and helps me learn in a different direction or try something new that I hadn't thought of. So the solution studio was like a really concrete way that I was harnessing that possibility. But I mean, it happens at an individual level every single day. Yeah, I mean, I do some palliative care, I do addiction medicine. I don't have an understanding of what it's like to be palliative of what it's like to experience death and dying and grief and loss in that really extreme way. I also haven't experienced the level of addiction that I see at the addiction clinic. And for me to really be open to learning about those experiences is so important. And I think the more that we gain expertise, the more that we think we know a story. And one of the other TED Talks that I always insist my students listen to is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She does The Danger of a Single Story. And
Yes.
that's what doctors can get stuck in, is we
Yeah.
think, oh, like, I know the story of heart failure. I know the story of trauma. We don't even have the superficial iceberg understanding of that individual story, and only they can understand their context. So it's so much about like really focusing not just on vulnerability, but on supports and resources, a lot of which are internal. And then staying really open to learning and gaining some understanding. I always say to the patients, like, you are the expert on your mind, body, and your experiences. And I'm the expert of like some Western and other philosophies on what healing looks like. Together, we will walk this journey, but we are doing it as, bringing together different forms of expertise.
Now, the Solution Studio you help run use tools like empathy maps and the iceberg model. How do these frameworks change the way that participants and practitioners thought about health?
And it changes the way I thought about it too. So as a physician, we're taught to work at the individual level. And when I started studying social innovation and design thinking, which is really where these models come from, I started to recognize like health happens at a systemic level. Like when I think about health, it's like, how does the health system respond? And what are those different supports? I will work with refugees or folks that are Indigenous. And I think about how the system either obstructs or supports their healing journey. And that was a really important piece for me to understand, both in terms of what solutions are possible, because it's not just here's a medication. It's like, well, how can we change the structural violence and trauma that's causing the problem? And you probably have a better understanding, but what I have is privilege and leverage, and I have a platform because I'm a TikToker. So like, how can I use all of those tools to advocate better and amplify your voice and your solutions? And then the other thing was that we can't solve trauma by like putting out one fire. We have to work so much further upstream to find out what are the systems that keep throwing matches. And when I think about the communities that are placed at risk and they're denied equity and agency, like the ability to control the things that they're exposed to, there's the system throwing matches. So unless we start doing system level healing, and that was what I really wanted to get across in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, is like, I can teach you nervous system, emotional regulation skills, and that's definitely a part of the book, but that's the individual level work. And so much of the work has to happen in community. And that was a really big light bulb moment for me.
That's fascinating. Wow. It sounds to me like you're always learning. You take each of these experiences to learn more and get more depth in your understanding of healing. So the men's chronic pain group that you described was such a surprising outcome. What does that experience say about the need for safe spaces for men in healing?
And again, I think I only understand the tip of the iceberg, because I hear it at the addiction clinic too, is the need for men to kind of co-design healing spaces, because women have been more vocal in mental health and there's more stigma for male presenting folks. So I don't think I have the answer to that, but I do really believe that if you've got a community that share certain lived experiences, they can solve that problem better. So I don't think I'm the person to answer the question, what do men need when it comes to mental health healing? But I do know how to facilitate the process where they figure it out. my expertise is like, what does the human nervous system know? I use something called polyvagal theory. So what does an underactive or an overactive nervous system do? And I can say that male bodies in Western society, they tend to go into fight and flight more because that's what they're socially conditioned to do. And there's a lot more shame and stigma if they go into freeze collapse. So when I look at that individual in front of me, that's a piece of the system that I know. But when it comes to designing the healing systems for male presenting bodies, that community has an understanding of it for sure. And sometimes it's groups and sometimes it's not, because for a lot of folks, they're not at the level that they would feel comfortable expressing it in public. But I do know that there's a big crisis, both with, I was reading this book, The Anxious Generation, and just reading how a lot of boys are getting sucked into like gaming or porn. And we think of these as really benign forces, but it's really changing the experience and trajectory of young people right now. So these are complex problems, and we can only solve complex problems and I want to use the word transdisciplinary because that's what my doctorate was in, is like, how do we look at things with more than one silo? So if a group of doctors come together to solve a problem, they all think that you're going to use a hammer on a nail. Whereas if you get people like social workers and community members and this transdisciplinary team, that's how you solve complex problems. So I'm just really interested in that, the study and solution generating when it comes to complexity, because all of the big things that we face around poverty and climate and pandemics, these are complex problems and we can't use hammers and nail.
So how do you define the difference between curing and healing? And why is that distinction so important in trauma work?
It's a great question. And I mentioned Lissa Rankin, but one of the people that she introduced us to had written this book. Trying to think of the name of it. I'll come up with it in a second. But her name is Rachel Naomi Remen. And she was one of the first people whose quote kind of helped guide my understanding of the difference between curing and healing. So Rachel Naomi Remen says that, and obviously I'm paraphrasing here, but there's a really big difference between healing and curing. And healing is when you're kind of walking alongside the illness experience. And this is what happened with her because she had significant experience herself. And curing is this desire to fix things. And as physicians, we're kind of like taught that that's what we're supposed to be able to do. And it's rare to do, especially at that systems level. But great healing can happen. So when I think about the work that I do in palliative care and medically assisted death, it's not curing, but it still can be healing. One of the first things I did when I wanted to go into this work was I called a death midwife. And I said, like, what does it look like to midwife or to be a doula at this stage of people's life and help guide that experience in a good way, even though cure is impossible. And a lot of physicians see death or like the end of the human system as a failure on our part. And I just see this as another opportunity to help guide healing.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Very different perspective there. So you shared a very personal story about almost stroking out during a night shift due to stress. How widespread is trauma amongst physicians? And why do we rarely talk about it?
And I think, Gertrude, this probably extrapolates to a lot of healthcare workers, especially now with the ongoing pandemic that's being ignored. Trauma is, and there's different levels. Like vicarious trauma is something I had studied. So vicarious trauma is the kind you get when you're witnessing suffering. And we all face that as physicians. Like we are constantly dealing with death and illness experiences and suffering and loss. And we're not told that it affects us too. Really, at the refugee clinic, we had a particular population of Yazidi women who had experienced the worst stories we had ever heard. I can hear the catch in my own voice when I think about them. And we had a whole clinic full of traumatized clinicians that had experienced vicarious trauma hearing their stories. It was really eye-opening for us to recognize just how much we had faced collectively, bearing witness to that level of suffering. But I think it's something that we all experience and we think, oh, I can handle it. But we're not really given tools on how to handle it. So that's what I love to share with physicians, just not just, hey, here are stress relieving tools for your patients. I love to teach body-based practices, and I'll say to them, oh, you can teach this in 1 minute. Oh, and by the way, you can do this yourself with a minute gap in between your patients. If you
Yeah.
feel yourself in an activated nervous system state, you're sweaty, your heart's pounding, your mind's racing, here are some body-based or somatic practices that you can do in between patients. Oh, and as an added bonus, you can teach them. So when I wrote the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I tried to write it at the level of patient understanding, but I'm really trying to get it in the hands of healthcare providers to say, hey, look, you need some tools yourself.
Yeah.
I think the pandemic has raised awareness that we are more traumatized than we were letting on.
That's true.
I didn't have an understanding of it before the earthquake at all.
So crazy. We have a question coming in from YouTube from a Mr. Lova. He says, my mother has severe muscular pain. What painkiller is better for her? Don't know if you can answer that. I guess it depends
No,
on what.
unfortunately, as physicians, we can't give medical advice without having
No, see,
understanding of the complexity. One interesting thing that I'll share around pain is that I didn't have a good understanding of pain before I started understanding trauma. So the pain pathway happens in a lot of different ways. Pain starts off as a signal that's in the periphery. So it's in an arm or a leg or your stomach. And then that peripheral or distanced signal gets sent through your vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve kind of runs up the back of the spine towards the brain. And I mentioned polyvagal theory, and that's kind of how trauma and pain are both sent up through that vagus nerve. The signal of danger. And pain is internal danger. It's like something's wrong in the body. I'm going to tell the brain, hey, brain, fix this. Something's wrong. The brain accepts this message through the vagus nerve, and then through different parts of the system where it kind of gets the pain fibers in particular, it registers in the cortex and sometimes the amygdala when it's really a danger signal. And then the brain decides how to perceive pain. If a person has been through tremendous trauma, their pain signal gets amplified. Sometimes. In some Indigenous communities, so First Nations communities in Canada, and I would presume in Australia as well, actually they experience hypoalgesia, or a turning down the signal and a dampened pain signal. So they might be in tremendous pain and you would never know. And it looks like stoicism, but it's actually the nervous system having experienced so much pain that it had to turn the signal down. So one of the things that I've learned through something called pain reprocessing therapy is you can use painkillers on pain, but you can also work with nervous system states. And I'm learning that so many of the practices I've learned as a trauma therapist also can be used in pain practices and helping people gain an understanding of what we can do to turn down the signals of the message in the vagus nerve and also the perception of pain in the brain. And that is not to say that your pain sensations aren't real or that your experience of pain isn't real. It's to say that you have more control over it than you think you did.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. You have such a breadth of knowledge. So now let's go on and talk about cultural and ancestral practices. You've studied Ayurvedic medicine, Qigong, and even visited traditional healers in Zimbabwe. How have ancestral healing traditions influenced your work with trauma today?
I think probably the biggest answer is that understanding of positive influences. Like, it's so easy of us as practitioners and clinicians to focus on the deficits, what's wrong, what's pathology. And I've really switched my lens to focus on what's right. Even within the brain, I'll say, like, why does it make sense that your brain is sending you these signals? Why does it make sense that your brain is trying to protect you? And at the community level, what have we always known about healing? And the more that we ask that question, we can often find traditional practices. So when I talk about things like circle dances or singing and chanting, that has been within so many different lineages around the world. And when we look at co-regulation, that thing I talked about a long time back, that's one of the ways that we were supposed to do it. And we don't do it anymore. I mean, how many of us get into our little box car and we drive to work and we get into our little box car and we go into our little homes and we're not dancing and singing together in community? And I'm not suggesting that that's the only solution, but could you go to a yoga class? Could you enroll in like pickleball or soccer? Could you join a knitting circle? Like, depending on what your physicality is and your interests, what can you do in community? How can you use your voice? So when I talked about the vagus nerve in both pain and trauma, one of the things that's really healing is to actually vocalize. So humming, singing, and chanting, those vibrate and help you regulate the signals coming up through the vagus nerve. It also creates a really long exhale, which is your calm parasympathetic nervous system. So I might suggest to my patients that they hum along with music and just create a playlist that helps your body calm down, things that aren't triggering for you. Hum or sing along to it. And they'll be like, what, that's trauma healing? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Your body knows how to do it.
Oh, I love it. And it's interesting that we have lost a lot of our ways with modernization. Even in African culture, we are not going back to our traditional ways of healing. Those circles you talk about, all of those concepts are now almost lost, which is a very sad thing to see.
Yeah.
So why do you think modern Western medicine has lost touch with community-based and ritualistic methods of healing that used to be so central?
That's such a big question. So we want to talk complexity. I mean, there's so many answers to that. A very big one is how much pharmaceutical research drives what we consider evidence-based medicine. So I believe in evidence-based medicine. I prescribe blood pressure pills and diabetes pills, and I think this is really useful for us to be able to have. I mean, now that I know I have blood pressure issues, I take them myself on busy days. But what I think we've lost in the search for evidence-based medicine is these ancestral practices that have always been around for good reason. Like Ayurvedic medicine is 10,000-year-old medicine. And one of the things that I did in the Modern Trauma Toolkit is I looked at this ancient Vedic understanding of mental health that they called the gunas. Sattvic, calm; rajasic, busy; tamasic, still. And I matched those same concepts that are 10,000 years old to polyvagal theory, which came up with the exact same things with very modern terminology around the dorsal vagal and the ventral vagal. It's all in the Modern Trauma Toolkit. I won't get into the weeds of the anatomy of it, but it was the same idea. It's 10,000-year-old reinvented in this modern terminology. And I think a lot of the modern concepts are things that we have always known. And we're just putting new words on them. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's for like somebody's branding it and they're trying to create IP and make money from it. And that's really harmful. So when I think about mixing capitalism and healing, that's where a lot of it's gone wrong. And I don't think, us healthcare workers should work for free, but like the way that we turned it into something that should make money for insurance companies or healthcare facilities, that's gone horribly wrong. So I really fundamentally believe in universal healthcare, that everyone has the right to foundational healthcare. And one of the concepts that has taken us in the wrong direction is this idea of making profit through whether it's pharmaceutical industry or research-based academic links. When I think about mental health in particular, so much of this, the DSM, which is the Bible of psychiatry, Alan Francis, he was one of the editors of an earlier edition. He came right out and wrote a book called Saving Normal, saying, did you know how much of us were in the pockets of pharmaceutical companies and how many of us were doing research where the outcomes were predetermined? I mean, the psychiatric medication companies are backing the research, and that means they get to bury the studies that show harm or don't show any good. This is a huge problem, and we need to solve this collectively. And again, it's not up to me to solve. We have to solve it in community, but we first have to accept the responsibility, because we're causing medical trauma, which is another huge problem within the health system when we don't.
Man, there are so many layers to this, so many layers. Now, let's go on and talk about psychedelic medicine. I know that you have now become a psychedelic journey guide. What role do you see psychedelics playing in trauma healing, and what barriers still exist in making them accessible?
Well, I mean, the studies are there. Level 3 studies are showing that psychedelics are really useful in the context of addictions, PTSD, even sometimes like severe anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts. So we have good studies. I think part of the problem is like knowing dosage control, like what is the right dosage that's not going to cause harm.
Yes.
We interestingly also know that the psychedelics as a drug class cause way less harm than alcohol, than smoking, than marijuana, which is legalized here in Canada. So when we think of a drug class, like I just keep wondering, why are they gatekeeping this one so heavily when we look at both the individual and the societal risk of psychedelics? It's way less than the stuff that's already legal. So I'm curious as to why there's been so many obstructions in front of it. Do we have more research to do? Absolutely. And have I seen people harmed by psychedelics? Absolutely. Like they are not 100% benign. I mean, I've seen some great harm come from them too, but we haven't sufficiently explored healing. And it's curious to me too, when we think about ancestral practices, because so many different cultures had relationships with plant medicine. And so that's part of the ancestral knowledge that's been lost.
Oh my gosh, I could talk to you forever, Christy. Thank you so much for coming online and sharing your wisdom with us. It's always good to have you here, sharing your knowledge. It's so deep and so wide. Keep studying, keep being a student of medicine, and bring this to the mainstream. I really thank you for taking the time to being with us today.
Thank you, Gertrude. Thank you, as always, for your brilliant questions. It was lovely to be here in your community.
An absolute honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. So we have had two very, very interesting guests to launch us off today. We're going to take a small commercial break while we wait for our next speaker. And while we're waiting, go and grab a cup of coffee, settle in, come back in about 15 minutes for the next speaker who will be sharing with us today.